Well, hi, I'm Gabby Llanillo. This is super cool because I've never been to Lisbon. I flew all the way from LA, super jet lagged. I'm already starting to black out, but it's okay. We're going to take you on a wild ride. Actually, that might be selling it up a little. But anyway, I'm here to talk about embedding and empowering your QA. And thank you again, DevGAMM, for having me. Super excited to be here and get to talk about, a discipline that isn't normally talked about in these types of large talks. So with that, let's get into it. Very large photo of me. I did not know it was going to scale that high. So I'm currently a QA supervisor here at Riot Games. I work on Valorant specifically. I know we have some fans. And also, we do have a map in Portugal. So that was very cool to be able to be like, I'm going to this thing. And I don't get to show it really in the presentation, but shout out, since we took a lot of the influences from the map for that. I actually have a background in computer science, and I also studied video game programming, so I use a lot of my technical background as far as what I do in my testing methods. So I started out as an IC, but then I pivoted into management because then I found out I actually love kind of growing my team and taking care of them instead of letting them go at the end of projects, which a lot of places seem to do to QA. So we're going to try to talk about how to mitigate that as well. Previous to this, I was at Naughty Dog working on The Last of Us Part 2. I don't know if you guys are familiar. There's also a show about it. And I worked as a QA lead there. I also worked at Square Enix for a little bit on localization, and same with Idea Factory. So it's been a mix of functionality and localization as my background. But yeah, so I assume everybody knows what QA is, so I'm not really here to talk about what we do. Here are some of the teams I worked with, as well as some stock images, because I don't have pictures of all the people I work with, so you don't know which one is which if you look closely enough. So yeah, I'm here to talk about really, or not really what about QA is, but rather what QA can be and how we can unlock their potential in next form, like a Pokemon almost. I wanted to start off talking about the question of where does QA currently fit into your team, and how often do you interact with QA? I hope in some capacity, because I don't know how your bugs are getting out there, or your games are getting out there without bugs, but I'm trying to see how we can improve that relationship, and I want you to kind of keep in mind this question throughout this presentation. So let's start with traditional testing. I think this is kind of what everybody is familiar with as far as the games that we've developed. This is kind of how I started in QA, where they added me towards the end of the game development cycle when things were about to kind of come out. As you can see here, it's usually 5 phases, sometimes also 6 if you're counting post-deploy support, live support games, for example. But this is typically the 5 stages. And you can see testing is a little bit too far for my liking, and it's not really what we want to kind of consider as sustainable as far as larger games that we're working on. That doesn't mean that it's not entirely unuseful, especially what I'm about to talk about with Dragon Quest, which was the first game I worked on. So I was working on localization specifically, which means the game had already come out in Japan, and my job was really just to ensure the translations and locales were actually good. So I didn't need to have a lot of experience playing Japanese RPGs. I just needed to learn English. So with that, that actually worked out pretty well because they were looking for entry-level people who wanted to get into games and not necessarily have a lot of background in RPGs and whatnot. So that actually worked out pretty well, adding us at the end of the cycle. And some other ways actually that we can look at waterfall testing and how it can still be sufficient. When workflow is predictable. So with Dragon Quest, Square Enix had already done a lot of these localization projects before. It was about 6 months that I was on it, which it's a 200-hour game, so that makes sense. But if I had to play it any longer than I had, I would probably have lost my mind. So that was a good amount of time, especially since the game wasn't really changing every day and it wasn't in development. When you can, sorry, I can't read this without my glasses, but it ensures like the team that can actually like plan out cost estimations because they know exactly how many testers they're going to need, and also kind of give a deadline going off of past projects with like similar time lengths. Another possible time where you can have waterfall testing be sufficient is when groundwork is already laid out. So kind of similar to the first thing, we already had past documentation and kind of like a framework to go off of. So that was pretty easy to kind of integrate into like the new games that we were doing if they were similar. And then also when issues can be identified without prior knowledge. So again, I wasn't like a huge RPG player. I just needed to know English and have like that background. And it's kind of same with like compliance QA. Here's some pictures from the game. Because you really only have to have the background of like console requirements and things like that. So projects like this, you can still use waterfall testing, and that can definitely be sufficient. And you don't really need to change that or involve QA any earlier. So, but wait, we don't really do that anymore, do we? Because we always want to make new games, and we want to kind of take everything to the next level. And we want to have like larger scopes and new features and things like that. So what do we do in this kind of scenario? Is anybody familiar with the term shift left? Shift left testing. Yeah, okay. Audience participation. So what is shift left testing? Good thing I'm here to tell you about it. It's the practice of moving testing and performance evaluation like earlier in the development process. So in this image, you can see that the traditional quality model where attention to quality is kind of like looked at there is now shifted left. So that's kind of visual, I don't know. But yeah, you can see that like the attention to quality is now kind of implemented earlier into the planning and design as opposed to closer to deploy and release. Why is this important? Well, testing actually early and often will catch all of these bugs and actually reduce the number of it while increasing the quality of the code, as opposed to just building stuff and adding things as they go and not really cleaning it up. Yeah, we like clean code, don't we? Potential blockers and also risks can be identified earlier. This is great because it mitigates crunch and you don't have to suddenly pivot like very last minute because you promised a stakeholder like we're going to do this and it's like we should have caught this sooner, and all these people, you know, as a manager, I especially want to mitigate that. All in all, like catching and fixing these bugs early will just lead to a significant cost reduction and a higher quality product. So I know I'm going quickly so you guys aren't able to take pictures, but what are some ways to adopt shift left in game development? So I'm actually going to go off of my own experiences. I do not speak for my employers, and I'm just going to kind of give you a rundown of all the different types of games I've tested, and there's like box games and also live service, so that's how we'll go. And we're going to approach this through like two ways that we've adopted shift left, which is the embedding part and the empowering. So The Last of Us Part 2, that was the game I had worked on, I think, for majority of my career. It's started out as like a contract tester, and I actually worked my way up to being like full-time senior QA. For those who don't know, it is a very high fidelity game with a focus on like narrative and cinematic like player experiences. So realism is actually a huge part of it. And majority of the team actually started out with waterfall testing because they come in and they already have some stuff to code, and they don't have a lot of familiarity already that you would actually like build up over time. So let's start with how that was embedded. So we had these things called point of contacts, which basically were separated into like areas or like languages and disciplines. So they're kind of put together here, and then with each of those point of contacts, they kind of worked with people from different disciplines, and we're all like those little pockets of like, okay, you own this level, you own this combat area, and they were the SMEs for those areas, and we're expected to kind of like keep up documentation, talk to the rest of QA about updates of like, hey, this level is going to get redone, or whatnot. And so it kind of just like allowed the rest of QA to know what was going on without having to be completely involved with everything. Just like broke up the work easily. And then you would develop like kind of a deep familiarity as like the POC for that area and know exactly what bugs to look for, which just like made things much easier. For example, here, the Seattle hub level is huge, and it had like many different areas that like didn't necessarily have a rhyme or reason of like, oh, you have to go to the guitar store first or blah, blah, blah. And you could like miss certain areas and things like that. But because it was so big, we had like multiple designers and scripters, as well as like QA POCs. And we wanted to switch them out every so often so that they didn't have tunnel vision. So that was how that was embedded. As far as how we empowered them, we actually had this thing called development support. So when I started at Naughty Dog, the actual like title of like my role was QA tester / development support. And so what development support is actually all these tasks that didn't really have to do with testing. So things like placing nav mesh was like a thing we got to do as QA. And again, like I was mentioning earlier with like realism, you don't want Dina kind of running through walls while you're like sad, especially in like that grounded, rooted realism that we were trying to aim for that. We also got to help with team pickups, or combat QA team got to help with item pickups. So like grounded mode, we were really the only ones being asked to play through that, so we knew exactly like, okay, we need this bar of health here. If not, we could die and just like not get through. So that was really cool insight that QA got to help with as far as like working with the design team on like knowing exactly how to resource balance and things like that. Surface tagging, so like if you have a wall, it's not gonna automatically, if you have a wall and then you put like a chain link fence art on it, an NPC is gonna walk by and not immediately know that, so we had to tag those walls as like, oh, you can see through this, you can shoot through this. And QA got to do that as like the POC of their levels because like they interacted with the area the most. And then photo mode support. I actually got to do this, just like how far the camera can kind of pull back and dolly. I was able to like help script that just because I was like, oh, this area is not as pretty. Let's kind of stick it in, you know, like kind of just like show what our designers like intended players to see. So yeah, actually having the context of the level allowed me to contribute in a very hands-on way, which was really cool. So I wasn't just yelling at my team and being like, fix that. I could fix that, you know? So that was a pretty cool part of like getting like a touch into the actual game and like leaving an impact that way. So my takeaway there was, despite adopting like waterfall testing, actually adopting like some shift left practices like embedding QA and allowing us to work in engine with our designers and developers, just like overall improve the quality of the game, which is really cool. So now we get to talk a little bit about Valorant. After a few years on working on like a kind of like a box game with like a start and finish and not much like post-launch support, I went over to the live service world. So for those who don't know, Valorant is a free-to-play game. You play as different agents and do a lot of fun 5v5 moments. And it runs on in-game monetization, and that's how it's able to sustain. With that, we have to constantly put out content that keeps our players engaged and excited, and will help them like grow the player base that way by inviting their friends and stuff. So how did we embed QA? Actually, it was very similar to how we had it at Naughty Dog, where we had like these pods that were broken down to people from different disciplines, like engineers, artists, and things like that. And you were given like an area of ownership, being very vague because cannot talk about secrets. But this is kind of like the visual of that. Oh, the artist S is down there. I should have caught that earlier. Oops. But the difference here is that as a QA engineer, you actually were handling a lot of external testers. So as a QA engineer at Riot, you are actually in charge more of like test planning and like a larger scope, as opposed to doing a lot of the manual testing on your own. But I did start out testing a bunch of like the manual stuff on my own, just so, you know, how can I tell people what to do if I don't even know how to do it, if suddenly the teams just like disappeared one day. So that was also good knowledge to have. As far as empowering, so we are in charge of a lot of different stuff over here at Riot. So as a quality lead, you got to align with like production as far as like sprint planning, know exactly like what bugs should go in each of those sprints. We would prioritize certain bugs that came up, triage them. So like anytime it would go to us, we would assess player impact and be like, okay, is this going to give a lot more like player hurt, or can we like push this into a backlog to work on our current sprint planning? We can assess like product risks and kind of be the main person saying like, hey, this is like not going to be great, or kind of give a heads up to the rest of the development team of like how this could affect them. So we kind of like took on a lot of different roles here, and you were just a lot more empowered in that way because you were immediately part of like the development team, and also managing external testers to do all of like the actual hands-on testing. We did that like around the clock, so we worked with teams in like Europe and in Asia, as well as the States, so that we have like rounded coverage, and then we have to do like follow-ups that way, and the onboarding processes for that were also up to us every time we would take a new vendor team on. So yeah, and then I also had a couple of like rituals that I really enjoyed. This is all agile based, by the way, so that's kind of like what we were just like implementing here. But some of my favorite ones are build reviews, usually led by me. I would take like kind of like the current build, go through with my designers of like what do we want to check, like what are we trying to hit this sprint, and everybody is in the meeting kind of like looking out for issues. It's not just QA. And then you would typically ask a lot of questions that you have about like design and things like that, just to make sure that the intent of your designers are coming through the way they want it to be. So that's really your job as QA. It's not your job to be like, oh, the players are going to hate this. You just want to make your designers look good, Bug refinement, so like you mentioned, there was like 1,000 bugs that might go in, especially for like a live service game. People are constantly breaking our stuff. And you don't want that to pile up, because then you're not really promoting like a good quality of bug backlog refining and things like that. So this is like something we did every week, just to go through the current backlog and assess it against like our current sprint plans. And we wanted to get a couple bugs like fixed each sprint, especially when it comes to like assessing the player impact. And we wanted to make sure the highest player impact bugs were the ones we were fixing. And then lastly, well, not lastly, there's many more, but this is the last of my favorite, is mind mapping. So we can go a little bit more into that, because this is going to be a very useful exercise. So mind mapping is actually the process of taking like a whole team's combined knowledge and turning something that's like scary and ambiguous and not really like something you can touch into something tangible. So a mind map can actually serve as like the basis of your test plan. So when it comes to a new feature, it shouldn't be up to QA to kind of think of everything this might touch and whatever. This is a practice that we usually do. And it will bring up questions that you have to aid in test case writing before code is even implemented. So here's a visual of that, and I'll stay here so people can take pictures. But say you have a new feature or a new map, like the map we had that's based on Lisbon. You would think about, okay, like what are the actual design specs? What are the tech specs? What are like the user stories? We can break these down into so that the work is less daunting, and we can put them into different sprints. The timeline to ship obviously is going to be very useful for that. And then the actual mind map itself will talk about, okay, how does this feature impact current like features that we already have? So maybe you would have like a UI mockup of the new thing, and then you would have the current UI you have right now, and then you would just go through the player journeys of both and find gaps there, right? And then if you have any debug tooling that might aid in QA, that's something you can talk about here as well. If we're going to need localization, that needs to get planned in. Performance testing, and of course, if there's any product risk that might like ruin the meta and upset players and things. And then requirements if you have specifically like compliance to like PC or console specs and things like that. So we're at the end. Takeaways, SpongeBob meme. If you adopt shift left practices, even though it might not be for every game, this is just gonna lead to like early bug detection, whether that's embedding QA early or adding them into like these meetings and things like that. Identifying risks early obviously means you have a lot more time to plan against that, which means people are going to crunch less. Planning for testability in early development actually utilizes QA, so that's why people are like, oh, like QA has nothing to do, like let's let them go. Like no, you can actually utilize them much earlier and help them be a part of like this mind mapping process. It prevents redundancy. And lastly, this is kind of like the main point of this, it's really less about problem detection and more about problem prevention. So I hope this was like useful in any way. Obviously, there's a lot of questions still to answer, but I hope this helps you improve your relationship with QA and help them reach their final forms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabby. That was great. I wish that other team I was talking about knew about this process. And I absolutely agree, because if you spot the problems early, sometimes it can change the process and make it better in a way that those won't happen in the future. So thank you so much. We have some time for questions. So if you have questions, please raise your hand and we'll make sure you have a microphone. One.
Thank you for your talk. Practical question. We are in an early pre-prod. So what's the best process for this stage of QA process?
Pre-prod. Yeah, this is kind of where like the whole like mind mapping thing I was talking about goes in, because especially if you're just starting out as a team, this will aid in helping that QA lead plan out headcount, because they'll probably come up with a test plan, like run it through themselves, take that kind of sense of time and time box, okay, how much is it gonna take for me to do a regression on what's currently in? That's obviously gonna grow and change as like more stuff like goes into test. And so, yeah, I think like just like involving like even one person in there and then expecting them to kind of plan out what that looks like for the rest of their team. That's the best way to approach it. But yeah, they're going to be it's mostly going to be used for like timeline planning and like also thinking about like risks coming in. But right, you don't have an existing product, so maybe it's less about like product risk because you're still making something and you're not really thinking about what it could break in your current game. But at least for now, if you're growing a team, that's what it's most useful for.
So yeah, again, thanks for the talk. Sorry, I'm also a bit, I don't know, jet lag, something like that. But so my question, and then sorry if I missed it. So the idea is clear to push the testing earlier, but practical steps. You said about like doing meetings, for example, weekly meetings, and then like build reviews and incorporating QA into that kind of a process, basically. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of physical manifestation of that idea, like connecting the QA to the development team or something like that. And anything else that I missed? Like, how can you do it, basically? What's the, you know?
I mean, yeah, it's just like involving them, yeah, in meetings just to start with. I think like, you know, when you're coming up with a new feature or a new plan to like what game you're trying to create, having them be in there, thinking about like the ways that they can test it, also thinking about what test database you want to put stuff in. Like, it's kind of up to the QA lead that you hire or are working with to kind of implement the best structure for your team. But then also it'll help with whether you're going to use Agile or Scrum or Waterfall. And so, I mean, how you do it, you just put them into the meetings early, and it's kind of their job to implement that. You're not supposed to teach, I guess, a QA lead how they want to lead their team. But at least like empowering them and like also giving them maybe the tools to like work in the engine. Like that's why I think a lot of QA leads are expected to at least know like whether Unreal or like Unity or things like that. And then you would like kind of list down like what you're looking in the job description, and I think like from there you would build up your team to include all of these moving forward.
Because I feel you. I guess I think I feel you because now usually in general QA is like they're separated from the development team, and there comes the time the QA let the QA out of the cages and they do something. So this kind of idea is to get them more connected, I guess, to the development process.
Yeah.
Get it right?
Yeah.
Something like
exactly.
that. Okay. Thanks. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I've worked with QA departments that had 75 to 100 people, and we've done, well, 10% of the great stuff you just talked about, and I wish we had thought of the other 90. But right now, I work for a AA studio. We have 2 testers. We're ultimately going to get to probably 6, maybe 10. And right now, we've got 2 projects, and both of the testers are embedded in both projects. They are, I mean, you're right. They have to be intimately involved in the project from day one. Well, day 100, because I spent a year alone thinking about stuff. But does this translate to a smaller team, I hope?
I think it still translates to a smaller team. I mean, at Riot, we don't have a lot of like contract testers. It's just like quality leads who are then pass their knowledge off to outsourcing companies. And so you would then manage like kind of like a team like Keywords or something who would like give you some of their testers. So I think like what you're doing at the beginning is great, but then this is more in terms of like scaling up. Because I still think that even with smaller companies, they kind of expect one person to know all of these things, and then eventually you have to learn how to delegate and then break down. Maybe somebody focuses more on managing and growing like their team versus like somebody's working on tools and focusing on like the IC stuff. So I think like, yeah, I think that's also one way that you can apply it like pretty early on development.
Any more questions? We have one.
Hi, thank you so much for the amazing talk. My question is, why use external testers? Does that not create a loss of knowledge over time? Is that not something troublesome, long time?
Yeah, well, I think like the thing is about like redundancy and stuff, a lot of the external testers are mainly used for manual testing, and the people you want to retain are the people who can make those test cases and test plans, because testing does take a lot of like manual time. Like there isn't really any AI testing, especially for subjective things like realism and testing for whether Ellie has blood on her clothes when you get out of a blood pool or something. And so that's kind of like why we would use external testers, because then also those people within like that outsourcing company will still have jobs after we let them go, because they'll just be put on another project, right? Whereas if you have a company that hires like 50 contract testers and lets them go at the end of that, yeah, there will be a loss of knowledge, but at least like with these testing groups specifically, like they'll have like other jobs to go to. But it's mainly like having like a quality lead who outlines all of the actual testing they have to do in like test cases or test plans. Like that's really the main knowledge part that you want to keep, because they're just like writing instructions for people to do stuff, you know? Does that make sense?
Perfect sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.